I'd like to welcome everyone to today's virtual meeting. I'm Tim Bobrowski, Superintendent of Schools in LSAC County. I think a lot of us are in a lot of stress time right now, but I would like to just remind everybody here, taxpayer dollars are being well spent at this time in at least the administrative offices. So if you have anybody griping and complaining, we probably need to send them our timesheets and logs. So we'll go ahead and get started. So Commissioner Brown, thank you for the invite from yesterday, and I see David Cook's on here, whose mind's whirling like it always is. I'm new at this. I do have some notes, and I'd like to thank Ms. Franker for helping me with it. So what I would like to do is ask Ms. Franker if we can to go ahead and start a roll call.
Absolutely. Danny Adkins.
Danny Adkins is present.
Tim Bobrowski.
Tim Bobrowski, present.
Harry Burchett.
Harry Burchett, present.
David Cox.
David Cox, present.
Keith Hale. David Raleigh.
David Raleigh, present.
Kelly Ransdale.
Kelly Ransdale, present.
Russ Tilford. Sheila Mitchell.
Sheila Mitchell is present.
And Superintendent Bobrowski,
Yes.
Superintendent Biggerstaff sent his regrets. He will not be able to attend today.
All righty. We sent him our regrets that he can't be with us, right?
That's right.
Jennifer, I'm sorry. I'm present. I had you on mute. This is Keith
Thank you,
Hale.
Superintendent Hale. Gotcha. Thank you.
Okay, I guess we'll go ahead and move on, and it looks like our first reading, or our regulations for the first reading and action, amendment to 702 KAR 7:125E, pupil attendance, first reading.
Before we get started with that, Superintendent Bobrowski, if I could just give a little context, and I think everyone knows this, but these are two emergency regulations you're going to hear today. We're going to give you the background. We're going to probably give you more information than you want, but we just want to make sure you understand, particularly if you're asked by your colleagues or others in your community why we're doing this. But these are emergency regulations we intend to take before the state board tomorrow in a special call meeting, assuming we get a favorable review from LSAC today that implements the attendance funding and the NTI issues that we spoke about, and have been to provide relief for districts and certainty and predictability for your funding for next year. The first part of that process was through a memorandum that was issued by me to you, to superintendents, signed by the Lieutenant Governor, and that process is such. She signed it as the Cabinet Secretary. That process was outlined in the governor's executive order that was issued in March for the pandemic, that talked about how certain statutes could be waived in an emergency if an agency provided a memo detailing the statutes that needed to be waived and then signed off by the Cabinet Secretary. So since we're technically under the Education Cabinet, Lieutenant Governor and Cabinet Secretary signed off on that. That started the ball rolling because we suspended some various statutes in a limited fashion related to attendance and SEEK to pave the way for this emergency reg. And then the emergency regs will then kind of give us the guardrails and the rules to follow for next year. And then in a nutshell, this enables you to do the hybrid learning and or continue to teach students at home if for whatever reason they're not sending their students at home and you want to do that. This paves the way for that. It does not provide an incentive or a disincentive for you to do that, and it also gives you a lot of predictability. So I just want to give you the overall context. You're only going to see this one time since it's an emergency reg. and Todd can talk about that process. I don't know if it rolls back to them in a permanent reg or not, but the board will be acting on it tomorrow. So didn't mean to steal any of your thunder, Robin, Kelly, David, and Todd, but I wanted to give that context.
Thank you, Commissioner. This is Todd. You're correct that I was going to go over the memorandum that was issued, but I think you've adequately covered that. The commissioner and department staff received significant feedback from school district superintendents through webcasts, as well as other school district staff, DPPs, et cetera, finance officers, regarding the need to create some type of hybrid model for the upcoming school year. The way our statutes are written, as you all know, is that funding flows for attendance when every student is expected to be in the school building, or during NTI when every student is expected to be learning remotely. And as a result of COVID-19, obviously there is a need for a hybrid model. So the executive order that was issued, of course, declared a state of emergency and encouraged all citizens to take feasible measures to engage in appropriate social distancing, and gave some flexibility to the commissioner as the agency head to issue memorandum explaining which statutes are temporarily suspended during this COVID-19 state of emergency. So following the feedback that we heard, Commissioner Brown issued that memorandum that did two things. Number one, it suspended the limit of 10 days on NTI days so that the emergency regulation can come forth and provide additional flexibility to grant additional NTI days. And it also temporarily decoupled the seat time attendance from funding and leaned toward the Senate Bill 177 model that allows districts to roll forward previous data that they've submitted to the department, previous attendance data that they've submitted to the department. As Commissioner Brown indicated, this is an emergency regulation and it will become effective immediately upon filing by the agency. So once the State Board of Education, assuming that they approve this tomorrow, we will file this with the Legislative Research Commission, and upon filing, it will become effective. I will turn it over to Associate Commissioner Kinney and her staff for more details.
Thank you very much, Todd, and it's a pleasure to be here with each of you. We're going to run through a fairly quick PowerPoint that we've prepared. Again, as Commissioner Brown said, just to give you a little more background information in case you get questions on this. Some of this information was shared earlier this week with the Interim Joint Committee on Education, as we brief them on our proposal and how we are moving forward to help districts have flexibility as we start the school year. So if we can go to the first slide, please. As all of you know, it's really taking the collective efforts of the governor, the General Assembly through Senate Bill 177, and the Kentucky Board of Education through their waiver process to help provide support and relief for local school districts. And the other thing that it's really taken is the input of you as superintendents, all your staff, including your operations staff, your finance officers, your food service directors, people transportation, all the folks, your local school board members, as we talked about the things that you really need to make sure that you can effectively move forward our instruction, and really thinking about how we are putting those concerns about funding as secondary. That's really what we're going to focus on today. Next slide, please. If we look towards Senate Bill 177, and really, since that is the most recent action taken by the General Assembly relative to attendance and funding as we ended our last school year, this seems to be a good place for us to start, and this is the direction that we're moving in. We've heard positive feedback from local school districts, and while we know as many things as we continue trying to operate in this pandemic virus situation, we know it won't be perfect, but it surely will get us off on the right start, and we'll continue to tweak things as we move along. Commissioner Brown has always been very receptive and has shared with local superintendents that we will continue to look at other provisions. But today's presentation, we're really going to focus on those attendance and funding issues. A refresher on Senate Bill 177, of course, it did provide emergency relief as we closed down the school year, but it expired at the end of the school year. So these provisions are no longer in place. And that's why we've had to take the actions that Commissioner Brown described earlier through the memo process. And now we're taking through the emergency regulation process. But Senate Bill 177 did provide that unlimited number of non-traditional instruction days, NTI days. It focused us on students receiving a minimum of 1,062 hours. And then it also had some other provisions that we really didn't have to utilize as much about instruction time and even instruction days on Saturdays and submitting plans if districts could not meet that 1062 instructional hours. We were very fortunate by really just extending some terms of the NTI that all school districts reached those 1062 hours by May 27th of this last year. Next slide, please. And very important in Senate Bill 177 was those provisions that allowed us to end the last school year focusing on how we were going to track attendance. As you all know, and you quickly responded to that, no longer having those in-person classes and went to an NTI remote instruction environment. Our current statutes really didn't contemplate everybody moving into that world as quickly as we did. So it was really important that Senate Bill 177 allowed this alternate way of doing attendance as we closed the last school year. As you know, districts, and very much appreciation to your finance officers and to you as superintendents in quickly determining which was best for your school district, whether using that attendance data from 1819 or the attendance data for 1920. We had 14 districts that chose the 1920 data, and everyone else stayed with that 1819. And we utilized that and will utilize that for the current school year that we're starting in the fall to calculate SEEK and any other state funding based in whole or in part on ADA. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, I think we all thought at the beginning that maybe this would be something that after spring break, we would all come back to school. But that wasn't the case. And we have pretty much come to a realization that we're going to be living with this at least for a little while. Senate Bill 177 did expire, and it only applied to the 1920 school year, and that's why we have to take the actions that we are taking at this time. Next slide, please. In prior presentations with superintendents and finance officers, DPPs, and other members of local school districts, we really were looking, as we knew this was going to expire, how do we continue and move forward? You as superintendents know, and sometimes it is difficult for really the general public to understand that as superintendents, you're always looking at the year behind you, the current year, and the year forward. At any point in time, you have to kind of have those 3 points in time in your mind. So as we start the school year in the fall, of course, we're better prepared through the actions of Senate Bill 177, but we're also starting the new year that we have to figure out attendance and how we calculate as it affects fundings for your next school year. So as we looked at the funding structure, we kept some kind of guiding principles in mind. We needed those principles in the structure to be temporary because we do anticipate that we will come out of the coronavirus pandemic. It needed to be explainable, flexible as you choose whatever model that you're choosing for instruction, and knowing that you may have to shift during the year. So it needed to be flexible enough to allow school districts to do that. And it also needed to be flexible enough that it really could apply to all 171 school districts. Predictable from maybe not from the exact dollar that you will know, but predictable as to the components and how they work. Verifiable. People are going to ask us, and rightfully so. And I think districts are very comfortable to be accountable for how this is going to work. So we needed to design something that was easy, verifiable, and familiar to the extent that a drastic switch in something so important as your funding would not be desired. And And as Commissioner Brown said, as we started, we wanted a model that did not incentivize or discourage those decisions for in-person or remote instruction. You ought to be able to make the best decisions possible for your students, for your staff, and for your communities. So we're trying to design something that kept that in mind. Next slide, please. So now we shift to student participation and funding calculations for the 2021 school year. Next slide. As you will see in the emergency regs, and as we go through those, the emergency regs will allow us to maintain the same AADA-related data choices that districts made previously and that we are utilizing for this school year. We are going to mirror strong provisions in Senate Bill 177. We will temporarily decouple attendance-driven funding to allow for participation. So you'll hear a strong shift, and David Cook is going to follow my remarks with what participation will look like and how we will capture that. And then it's important that that district calendar and attendance decisions not be impacted by funding. Again, allowing those decisions to be made without apprehension about what funding will look like. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to turn it over to David, and David's going to walk us through EI and sort of the provisions that will allow participation to really be the piece that we focus on for the next school year, and student engagement. So David, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Robin, and good morning, everyone, again. Next slide. We'll go ahead to the next slide. I'm going to harken us way back, Superintendent Bobrowski, to 2011, when you were one of those pilot districts. And that's how long we've been doing NTI, and that is probably one of the biggest reasons why we had, as hard as our spring was, we had a less difficult time than a lot of other states, because we had that foresight to be thinking about a model like this, even though we didn't ever anticipate using it the way we have used it and will be using it this fall. The program went statewide in 2014-15, and as Robin mentioned, Senate Bill 177 gave us unlimited NTI days for the last spring. And then on the March 18th, the state board approved a waiver of the application deadline part of the regulation, so that all of your districts could apply and be a part of NTI this spring. Next slide, please. As we've already talked about, in the spring of 2020, the General Assembly passed Senate Bill 177. And we had the application deadline. And then I wanted to point this out because this is always an interesting fact. Normally in a school year, when we've used NTI before, and districts that are on the call, Superintendent Burchett and others who have used NTI previously, we get about 3 to 500 NTI days in a given school year. We did 6,240 just in March, April, and May. So that gives you an idea of the change and the big flex we made in the program. Next slide, please. So what we did this spring, because of the depth and the fast way in which we implemented NTI for all 172 districts, is we created an opportunity for districts to submit to us their participation on a weekly basis. It's a little more manageable. We're going to talk a little bit more about what the requirements are going to be for the fall in light of the decoupling of the attendance. But what was most significant about last spring for us in my division that deals with NTI regularly is that we kept our numbers pretty much like they were on a regular NTI year. So anytime we can keep participation above 90%, that's a good thing. So we're really excited that that's what happened this last spring. Next slide, please. So The difference that you're going to see is twofold in my estimation, or threefold, actually. I wanted to bring up another point, and Commissioner Brown kind of alluded to this a little bit, is because you have the notion now of hybrid models, where you're going to have some kids in person and some kids remote. We sort of have to shift our the way we define NTI from just a day that we close school and have an NTI day to being more of the structure of remote learning in Kentucky. So non-traditional instruction is any time that a kid's doing remote learning. So you could have some kids doing it and some kids not. So it's not just focused now. It's not just like, okay, this is an NTI day, it's NTI. So that's important, I think, to remember. But the biggest thing is a different way that we're looking at, not a different way, but a deeper way we're looking at participation for this coming school year. The first thing to remember is all children will be coded in IC with a participation daily. So if the student is in person, then that's pretty simple. That's essentially the same thing you did with attendance. So when a student is in person in your classrooms, the participation you're going to record, the teacher's going to record in IC, is they're there, right? So what we need for IC is participation for those kids who aren't there. How do we see the kids who aren't in face-to-face in-person instruction? So we have created a shift, if you will, to that model. Next slide, please. On this slide, you will see there are going to be 4 options for a teacher to record participation. We're going to have daily participation being recorded in NTI, but you'll notice here in a second that the recording of that participation does not necessarily have to be daily. It can be done at the end of a week. But the first way is, and most of these ways are reminding us that we're hopeful and we're very excited that in the spring application season, when all of you all submitted new applications for the fall, we saw a huge shift away from being a primarily paper-based situation to focusing more on a digital platform basis with paper being the secondary. So it's sort of shifted from primary being paper to primary being digital, with still obviously having some paper, but less paper than you had before. So that makes some of these participation things much more prevalent. The first being the idea that students and teachers would have one-on-one chats, phone calls, interactions. Remember that the word interaction is very important. Participation is about the engagement between the teacher and the student. It's not about performance. We hadn't mentioned that yet, but remember that participation is essentially trying to substitute for attendance. What do we know if the student was engaged in the instructional process? You're still going to do grades for all kids, and that's how you're determining performance. So you're not deciding that because a kid turned in a packet of work or did digital work, that work is an A grade or a B grade or C grade. That's not what NTI and what we're doing with participation is about. It's about, did they do it? That's the point. So those one-on-one video conversations, those interactions between teachers and students, a group interaction between teacher and some students. Pointing out it's important to remember that those individual interactions don't have to be between the teacher and the student. They could be between the teacher and the parent or caregiver if the student is young or has special needs. The third item that we count as participation for remote learners is time spent in a learning management system, Google Classroom, Canvas, any of the others that your districts might be using, so that you have documentation that a student has been in the system and has been working on their work. And then finally, that submission of an instructional packet that many of you have done. And again, that's the one where, because we know many of you do weekly packets for those kids who are paper-based remote learners, then we would see that you could take those weekly packets and the teacher could go back to the beginning of that week in Infinite Campus and punch the button for participation for each day that you can see the packet being completed. So you don't have to enter it every day. The teacher doesn't have to sit down with those remote learners doing paper and, well, I don't have their paper. Well, then you can't. It's obvious that you would have to wait until there was a time when you collected those packets, so that the entry into the system is not required every day. It's just that you're going to be putting a check mark, if you will, in for every day of participation. Next slide, please. I don't know if that's my, I guess I can, you want me to do that one, Robin, or I can let you go back to that one, or?
Either way, David, I think really what we wanted to include, we added a slide to talk about the reporting process. And you've kind of touched on some of this, but the districts will report both in-person and non-traditional instruction through Infinite Campus, and Infinite Campus is working on what that will look like right now. We have recommended that district participation, and it is at the district level, will be reported in October, January, and July. That allows for us to communicate how well districts are engaging their students to the general public and to the General Assembly. We will post it to our KDE website and report it to LRC. And the other thing that we know, this will be kind of a different shift for some of your staff. We've been talking with the DPPs, and we know that this will not be, quote, attendance. And so many of them have concerns about how this will work. So my office, the Office of Finance and Operations, along with David's office, the Office of Continuous Improvement and Support, are going to pair our teams together, and we will be available to help your districts as we learn together how to collect, record, and report participation. So we'll be offering our assistance as we roll along, so we make sure that everyone has an opportunity to learn more about it and how to report that appropriately.
And Robin, I just wanted to say, I don't think you even knew this yet, because Jesse and I have just sort of worked it out. But my team, my staff are going to be lined up with Jesse's staff, so that you'll have if you have one person who's your OFO person, your field staff person who does that stuff, you'll have the same district will have a person from my staff assigned, and we won't have different districts with different, you'll all know who your two people are.
Right.
And there'll be a team. So.
Right. So David, I just added that slide at the end, so we made sure that we talked about reporting and how that would work.
Okay. What is the next slide? I
think the next slide.
Oh, that's it. Okay.
Yeah, we're finished. If we can now turn to the actual regulations, or let me pause here for just a moment before we actually put up the regulation and quickly kind of point out where the information we have shared with you is located. So Chair Bobrowski, if you want to entertain any questions at this time, I'm sure David and I'll try to answer.
Well, let's open the field. Superintendent, what kind of issues and concerns or praises have you got out there for the KDE staff pertaining to this particular item on the agenda?
The only question that I had just is, do these only require one reading? Because it's going to the board tomorrow, correct?
Yes. So it's an emergency regulation. In order for us to get an emergency regulation, does have a more expedited process, both here at KDE and in the General Assembly process. They actually become kind of final effective as soon as we file with LRC. And I don't know if many of you are aware, but it almost takes a year now to do a regular regulation, and we just don't have time for that.
Okay, thank you. I was just curious.
Commissioner Brown, Mrs. Kinney, this is Danny Atkins. I'd like to thank you for what you put together here, because again, this kind of eases my mind as far as being able to move forward with the things we have to do, and not concerned about the funding aspect and its aspect of those types of things. Certainly eases my mind. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hearing any other questions?
Superintendent Bobrowski, I'd just like to echo Superintendent Atkins's remarks on that. I've heard from a lot of my fellow colleagues here in my region, superintendents, about the concerns of this and how we would handle student attendance and funding, and it does ease all of our minds. So I support it 110%.
All right. So at this point, I guess Robin and David, how would you like to proceed at this point as part of your presentation?
We're happy. I will just quickly point out in the e-regulations themselves, you should have copies of those with you, kind of the high level where you can look for certain provisions that we have talked about. And I'll start with the attendance regulation, e-regulation. And you know, you can either flip through right now, or if you want to take some notes just so that you can go back and revisit. But we really for the student attendance regulation, we talk about daily participation. It starts on page 3, section 2, and you'll see that that's where it really starts talking about what participation will look like, both, as David explained, for those in-person students that are in your classroom, so you already know how to do that. It does on the next page, on page 4, it talks about the non-traditional instruction participation. So you can see that that's where we have those different measures, how you can, thank you, Joette, for putting that up. On page 4, line 17, yeah, there you go. That's where we start seeing those participation that David walked us through, and on to the next page. On page 5, there where you see those 4 different types of ways that participation can be measured. And then the next place that I would refer you to is page 9. And that is section 7, which is line 22. There you go. There you'll start seeing those due dates for the reports and what that will look like. Again, as we talked about, reporting in October, January, and then in July. And then the last place that I would point out is on page 13. The very last line of page 13, and I know we're going through this quickly, but that's where we start, where the commissioner's authority to approve those unlimited number of NTI days, and it spills over into the next page. So there we see those commissioner's authority to grant those unlimited student NTI days. So those are really the key components that the E-Reg will allow, the adjustments that need to be made to be able to effectuate those, that shift from attendance to a participation. And then just very quickly on the other emergency regulation, which is about our SEEK and funding and the tie to that. And the reason we have to have the 2 different regulations because we are changing those attendance, how we do attendance, and then corresponding that to your SEEK funding. And really the primary page to look at in that regulation is page 4. And I'm going to wait just a second to allow Joette to kind of pull that up for us. Thank you, Joette. So really it's a lot that is on page 4. So it applies to the 2021 school year only that you see there in section 2 and line 4. And it explains why we're doing this, allows us to utilize this variety of instructional delivery models rather than relying upon attendance and how we've calculated in the past. I think the important part too is, you know, this will be very, very similar to how we have ended the school year. So for those things, AADA, you know, it's known at this point, at-risk numbers that rely upon that, home hospital, and SEEK transportation. All those we'll do just like we're starting this school year, kind of lock those in based upon the data, just the data that we used either by your selection of 1819 or 1920. And then there will be some things, Joette, if you could, oh, there it is. It's there down in section 3. Oh, I'm sorry. Keep scrolling down just a little bit. There we go. Down to at the bottom of page 4, subparen 3. Joanna, if you could go back up just a little bit to the very bottom of page 4. There it is. At very bottom, line 21. So it does, just as we're doing this year, it will use current year data for some things. So there at the very bottom in line 21, it tells you that your property assessments, your district tax rate levied, equivalent tax rates, exceptional children, and LEP student counts will all be current year counts. And this is exactly what we did this past year. We have used your current year counts for that information as we are funding for the upcoming school year. It also, just like in Senate Bill 177, talks about any other state funding based in whole or in part on average daily attendance. And that really is, it's not contained in this reg because it doesn't outline those. But as you all know, our budget bill routinely in the LARS line items, there's a few that are AADA, have some components of AADA for their calculations. So for example, extended school services, and then some components of safe schools and KETS. So again, those funding areas will utilize your 1819 or 1920 data to the extent that that data is needed to calculate those. And this is right in line with how we've done your upcoming school year. So very appreciative. Senate Bill 177, of course, gave us kind of this guidance and direction. As we reported to the Interim Joint Committee this week, they seem supportive. So I think that gives us a lot of confidence as we move forward. Of course, you know, in the world that we live in, when we're talking about budgeting and revenues, this does give us a level of a starting point, I would say. I think we all still are kind of have that anxious feeling about what the revenue collections will yield, as well as any reductions in budgeted amounts that we know of right now. So, but I think this gives us at least a little bit of certainty of where we're starting. And we hope that is very helpful for local school districts. So does anyone have any questions about the emergency regs themselves?
Ms. Keeney, thank you for doing such a great job, but I do have just a couple, and maybe it may resound. And I'm just asking a question for my own purposes here, but tax rates stays the same, it sounds like. So how would you suggest that schools do that as we normally have done in the past?
You know, that's going to be challenging. I think we'll just have to roll along together, really. It's going to be challenging because we're very much, and that's why I kind of ended my comments the way I did, because we're going to be in a situation where we're not really going to know what revenues are going to yield. Right. And that puts school districts in a really, really tough spot.
Well, maybe I could clarify mine just a little bit. So it's time for us to set a September. We're trying to set our tax rates. Would we be better off just to go ahead and use the same numbers from the previous year, or just make note that we're going to leave it as is for this particular school year?
I don't know that I can answer that. I think that is your decision, how best to tackle that. And, you know, your community input and what that looks like always drives decisions for local school districts. So I don't know that I have a specific answer for your specific district, but it's a tough one. It really is.
Okay. That's fine. I appreciate the honesty. That way we know that we got to go to work a little bit more. So we'll figure that one out as we move.
Yeah.
Another question scenario. So I have a homebound student that's working at home, and we normally in the past have sent people out to do the work. Obviously, that's going to have to be modified this school year to help with that child. If we're doing remote learning now, is there any changes in how we would report that from the DPP's end?
Yeah, so for our home hospital students, the attendance regulation actually was already amended. In fact, it just went into effect where we allowed through that attendance regulation for remote instruction for home hospital students. So you do have that authority already to operate in that environment for your home hospital students. We saw that as sort of a gap. It seemed like the reg hadn't caught up with reality. Even before the coronavirus pandemic hit, we were scratching our heads going, why are we requiring in-person instruction for those students if that quality instruction can be delivered in a remote manner through technology? So that attendance reg has been amended already before this even hit. So we had really good timing in that regard.
Thank you. That's all the questions I have.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Hearing no questions, let's proceed. At this point, when I look at the agenda, of course, we have presented to us, I know we have regulations that we need to take a look at and vote. I would open the floor for any more questions from our superintendent body. I don't want to rush the process, but at the same time, I'd be respectful of your time as well. So, Commissioner, would you like to add anything?
I would just add, well, thank you all for your feedback all these weeks and months. You all filled the blanks in on these E-regs because this is what we heard from you, and you all led the charge on thinking outside the box. Well, there's really no box right now, but about the hybrid learning and those ideas, you all were on the forefront of that, and we're following along and trying to do what we need to do at the state level to make it happen and make sure you all are successful next year. And as Robin said, we're likely to have additional waivers as we continue to go forward. Ideally, we would have one big package of this stuff, but we continue to see issues that are popping up as we deal with one issue. Then obviously we think ahead to the next thing, which is, I think, normal. But just know that we may need to kind of reserve the right to bring you all back for a potential additional emergency regs and or guidance as we move forward this school year.
Well, Commissioner, you've done an outstanding job, and I think everybody around the table would all agree. And I know your time is getting short there in your position, and I'm sure you're glad. But at the same point in time, your leadership has been outstanding, and I want to thank you personally, as professionally, for doing such a good job and keeping everyone informed. I told someone the other day about, we have so much guidance now that the excuses are out the door because we have all the tools, and your team there at KDE has really done a phenomenal job. And I just want to thank you guys for that work and that effort. And I know you can see it's been a team effort, and that's what really counts. So thank you for that.
It has, and as soon as this meeting is over, Todd, I need you to get back to those contract negotiations with the candidate there.
Yeah, okay, good deal. All right, are we ready for a vote?
Superintendent Bobrowski,
Yes.
this is Harry Burchett. I'd like to make a motion that we approve 702 KAR 7:125E for under the emergency clause for a first and final reading to go to the state board.
We have a motion. Do we have a second?
This is David Raleigh with LaRue County Schools. I'd like to second that motion, please.
All right. We will need to have a vote. Are there any other comments, questions, or concerns? Let's move forward. We would like to have a roll call, please. Ms. Fraker.
Got it. Danny Adkins,
Danny Atkins, yeah.
Tim Bobrowski,
Tim Bobrowski, yes.
Harry Burchett,
Harry Burchett, yes.
David Cox,
David Cox, yes.
Keith Hale,
Keith Hale, yes.
David Raleigh,
David Raleigh, yes.
Kelly Ransdale,
Kelly Ransdale, yes.
Russ Tilford,
Russ Tilford, yes.
and Sheila Mitchell.
Sheila Mitchell, yes.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, at this point, we are due for one adjournment item here, and that'll finish us up for today. Again, I would just ask David, if you wouldn't mind, could you send us that PowerPoint that you had about the participation rate or the explanation? That was really easy for folks to understand, and I think our people could understand that probably a little easier than the reg. Is that possible?
Hey, Tim,
Yes.
Superintendent Bobrowski, if I can, I just made a motion just on the first reg there, 702 KAR 7:125E. So someone will need to do the second one as well there before we adjourn.
I'm sorry. I got a little excited there because it was getting kind of late in the day here. So, okay. So let's call for a vote from then on the second reg. Need a motion, please?
I'll make a motion. Danny Atkins, make a motion on the second regulation.
This is Sheila Mitchell, I second.
Okay. We have a motion and a second. Any questions, concerns, discussions? Let's move forward. Roll call, please, Ms. Fraker.
Danny Adkins,
Danny Atkins, yes.
Tim Bobrowski,
Tim Bobrowski, yes.
Harry Burchett,
Harry Burchett, yes.
David Cox,
David Cox, yes.
Keith Hale,
Keith Hale, yes.
David Raleigh,
David Raleigh, yes.
Kelly Ransdale,
Kelly Ransdale, yes.
Russ Tilford,
Russ Tilford, yes.
Sheila Mitchell.
Sheila Mitchell, yes.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay. No other items on the agenda. Let's have an adjournment motion for today's meeting.
Motion to adjourn, Kelly Ransdale.
Second, Dave Cox.
Roll call, please, Ms. Fraker.
Got it. One last time. Danny Adkins,
Danny Atkins, yes.
Tim Bobrowski,
Tim Bobrowski, yes.
Harry Burchett,
Harry Burchett, yes.
David Cox,
David Cox, yes.
Keith Hale,
Keith Hale, yes.
David Raleigh,
David Raleigh, yes.
Kelly Ransdale,
Kelly Ransdale, yes.
Russ Tilford,
Russ Tilford, yes.
and Sheila Mitchell.
Sheila Mitchell, yes.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you all for taking the time today to join us. no other issues going on. If you do, call me. I'll be around, running around somewhere with my head cut off like the rest of us. Have a good day. We'll see you guys later.